Africa has a rich history of Islam. Africa is not a monolith. For some people's image of Africa is the malnourished child. The brain drain is real and it's substantive. After colonization, there was a divide and conquer mindset that happened that led to division on a map. We need to go beyond the colonial barriers. It's rough in Nigeria. You need to provide water for your home. Electricity often goes off. That's why we need to move from aid to talking about trade and investment. Islam recommends some sort of wealth tax.
Africa is a resource-rich continent with immense potential. When countries within the continent demonstrate good governance and sound economic judgment, they thrive. It is, of course, oversimplistic to discuss Africa as a monolith. Yet some regions, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, continue to grapple with debt, poverty, and civil conflict. This is why the continent remains the most underdeveloped, leading to a brain drain of its most talented individuals to more prosperous nations. To what extent has the legacy of colonialism, in both its historical and contemporary forms, contributed to these challenges? And how do we evaluate its potential, and what about the Muslim population, which numbers around 430 million, almost half of the continent? Now, to help us untangle and demystify Africa, we are honored to have on the Thinking Muslim Professor Abdoulaye Ndiaye, an assistant professor of economics at New York University Stern. He has written extensively about his home country, Senegal, and has recently published intriguing articles examining the Islamic concept of zakat and economic inequalities in the context of the Muslim world. Professor Abdullah, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah. Thank you for having me in beautiful London.
Jazakallah khair. Well, it's wonderful to have you with us. This is your first time in London, by the way.
This was my second time. I came way back when in my student years when I was in Paris as a student. We came for the theater and I came to Cambridge for some things like Model UN way back in the day. At the time, all I did was visit the Buckingham Palace. Today, I had a wonderful guide who showed me the economic history of London and all to see. So it's really a pleasure to be here.
So just for our viewers, your guide was Riaz.
Riaz, yes.
Thinking Muslim.
Riaz Hassan.
So he showed you around the economic highlights of London.
Yes, I think he can put that into a product, the economic tour of London by Riaz.
What did you see, but coincidentally?
Yeah, so I took a picture with Jeremy Bentham, you know, the father
UCL,
of UCL. So he's the father of utilitarianism, which economists deal with, grapple with a lot, especially like people who work on issues around when you think of what is the best thing to do, what called normative questions. So when you work on issues around inequality, around public finance, Jeremy Bentham says we want to do what is best for the greater good.
Yes.
And he illustrated this fact by saying that at his death, in his will, he put that they should expose his body. So when you go to UCL, there you have the bones of Jeremy Bentham put in display. They put like a body around it with clothing and all that. So I had the chance to benefit from this utilitarian act of his. We saw also places where Karl Marx in the library worked to write his Das Kapital. We saw John Maynard Keynes' old living quarters and many other sites really that gave me an overview of the history and economic history of this city.
That's really interesting. I mean, we're here today to talk about Africa, but in that context, many African students, especially from the elites, they come to London and to America, of course, to study economics from a very Western lens. So some of those great names, or those names that you mentioned, Bentham and Keynes and Marx, would of course be part of that curriculum. This may sound like a very I don't know, a rudimentary question, but to what extent do we need to move away from these Western figures of economics and think about different models and behaviors moving forward?
Yeah, economics is a very broad field, and it has been studied by many Western figures.
Yeah.
Now there has been a lot of a movement to understand developing economies as a laboratory where there are a lot of questions to answer, and because growth is very important. One of the reasons why I'm in this town as well is because of a conference that I co-organized on structural transformation and economic growth at Oxford.
Yeah.
And there has been some revolution since the 2000s, of a credible revolution, to think of how we use methods from medicine to go and study economics in the developing world. This is done by Westerners, Africans alike. Now it is growing, and there have been Nobel Prizes that have been awarded for development economics. And development economics, the idea really is not just to transpose theories, thinking from here, but really look at the challenges, the frictions, and the issues in Africa, in the developing world, and study those and really propose solutions that are adapted to those countries. And this research is done equally in collaboration, both by Africans and non-Africans. Africans with their training in economics, but also their institutional knowledge as well.
Fantastic. I mean, I said in my introduction that we hope to shed a light or draw some attention to Africa today. And of course, it is quite depressing, and maybe I will fall into this trap here today, but it's quite depressing that we lump all African countries, the diversity of African countries, into one monolith. But to contradict myself, like paint me a picture of the economics of the continent. Like, how do you assess where Africa is in terms of development today?
Yeah, like you said, Africa is not a monolith, so there will be a lot of places we can go when we think of Africa. The economies are diverse. You have some economies that, like Nigeria and Angola, that rely mostly on petroleum exports, while some other economies like Kenya or Ethiopia will focus more on agriculture. Okay, and you have some other economies that rely more on tourism. Some other economies will try to do a mix of all of these. In terms of where we are, I think most of the growth that has happened, there have been sustained growth after the independence, have been driven mostly by commodities. And these have been low value add growth, mostly minerals, okay, that are exported. And some of the challenges has been that the infrastructure in place has been mostly infrastructure that is there to essentially carry these extracted minerals overseas, mostly to Europe. And there are other challenges related to skills, education, and human capital overall, which is the potential for people to produce goods and services. And these are related to these institutional factors that I started alluding to. And so there are still challenges that are associated with that, broken borders as well, that create instabilities in certain areas. Now, the challenges in West Africa are different. You have the relationship to manage with France and some colonial powers. In East Africa, you have some of the challenges related to Sudan, conflict. In Central Africa, you have the Congo. In South Africa, you have issues around unemployment. It's in South Africa, and North Africa as well is dealing with its own challenges. So overall, this is the continent where growth is going to happen in the future. it's a very young continent as well. So there are a lot of questions to resolve, but also a lot of good developments that have happened in 2024 and over this the previous century as well.
When we talk about, you gave us a really clear picture of the different challenges and the different regions and countries within Africa. I mean, if there was one country you could cite where economically things are going well, where would that be?
So I think so. Benin is a good example of a country that has potential. And Senegal as well, where I'm from. So I want to give an example. So Benin has done a lot of reforms to have investment to take off, and also has the proximity with Nigeria. Nigeria is the largest economy in Africa, and also they also benefit implicitly from the fact that the Nigerian government subsidize energy, oil, and they are close to Nigeria, so they benefit from it. But if I want to give just the whole picture, the example I'm going to give of what shows the good things and the challenges in Africa is actually from where I grew up. So it's a neighborhood in Dakar, the capital of Senegal, Kermassan. So I grew up in Kermassan. We moved to Kermassan, and this was because I want to talk about the story of cities in Africa, because it's good to update people's image of Africa. For some people's image of Africa is the malnourished child, but do you want you to think of Kermassan as a prototype of some annexed part, connected part to a part connected to a city or a city in Africa. So we moved there. It started not many people living there. Good quality of air, good quality of life. We moved there away from the more dense suburbs. Kermassan had one industry, company that was producing poultry. Over time, people moved to Kermassan, more people moved to Kermassan, it became a larger city. And one of the challenges and the city started growing, some low to middle income people were living there. Then there was flooding happening all around Senegal. And these are some of the issues both related to urban planning, in cities without strong urban planning, but also related to climate change. So there were more people who moved to Kermassan, but also it started being more dense and congested. So you have cities that are dense and congested. And in these cities that are dense and congested, you have a lot of economic activity now in Kermassan. There is a big market. So you have a lot of informal activity happening, right? So this is without formal accounting procedures. This economic activity is very dynamic. 50% of GDP in Senegal is in this informal sector. Now, this economic activity also, in terms of how it organized, has some drawbacks, right? So these are small-scale businesses. So the medium and small enterprises, some of them fail. It's hard for them to get financing and to scale up, to go from the table in the market to the store to a supermarket. So you mostly have small stores. And as well, what came with this congestion as well is that that main industry, the Sedima, had to move to another place. So pollution being also one challenge as well. As this in this example, representing also that you have cities that can be very polluted. One other point in this particular Kermassan, why I mention it also, when we think of Africa often, the element of security comes into play. So that's where the Dakar race, the big trucks that used to go from Paris all the way to Dakar, passing through the Sahara, used to arrive near Lake Redba, near Kermassan. And that's a beautiful pink lake. It's really beautiful to see. So when I was a kid, we used to go and watch these giant trucks and motorcycles and SUVs crossing all the desert and arriving there. That beautiful race has moved to South America at some point in the UAE, and then it stopped, I think. and mainly because of terrorism and instability in Libya, in all the Sahara as well. So it's also a microcosm, an example of the issues that happened around Senegal and in Africa as well, of sometimes conflict and instability. And it's a city now that has become, Kermassar, one of the largest cities with a lot of youth unemployment as well. Okay, so a lot of potential, like I say, a lot of young people, a lot of energy and dynamism, okay, but a city that has a lot of challenges. And that's an example for me of the updated view of Africa for people.
Thank you very much. That's a very evocative picture you paint of your home city. You talked there about one of the benefits of Kermassar is a young demographic.
Yeah.
Now, we often associate Africa to be overpopulated, you know, and that's a very crude way of putting it. And many Western economists argue that as you urbanize and as you modernize, your population will slow down and your younger population will slow down. And so in our minds, at least in the West, we associate countries in Africa that have large burgeoning populations to be somewhat of a curse, in inverted commas. Is that how you see it when it comes to Africa?
Yeah, not at all. I think it's actually there are challenges associated with finding jobs for the youth.
Yeah.
But it's more short term.
Right.
I think the challenge really is how to harness this potential.
Yeah.
Currently, 75% of Africans are less than 35-year-old.
Right.
And Africa is supposed to be the labor force of the future.
Yeah.
And now the question is, how can it attract clientele from around the world where it could allow to earn higher wages? Now, that I think is the way to answer the question. I think the examples of countries like India are pretty useful for many African countries, which is how to develop an IT industry that is strong enough, broadband, accessible all around, so that we can develop services that can be useful for the world. Now, these services, like in the example of call centers and other IT services as well, and increase also the educated population that can do these jobs as well. Yeah. The reason why I mention is we need industries as well. Those are important. But when you look at service, on the service part, this is a place where we can do a lot. And we already have mobile phones. So Africa leapfrogged from going from the phone lines, not to the computer, directly to the mobile phones. Yeah. People use mobile money. More than 35% of mobile money users say they use it also for saving, right? So the question is, how do you have internet accessibility all around so that people can do productive activities from their phones as well? So I think really this notion of productivity, pushing it, can be beneficial for the youth and can be beneficial for population at all. So I don't think that there is any policy whatsoever that needs to be done in terms of controlling population. China has a very large population, and China has found ways to grow in it. Certainly with manufacturing helping a lot. Africa needs manufacturing. There are challenges. We can talk about it. But that's I think it's more of an opportunity than a challenge.
And how real is the brain drain in countries like Senegal or Nigeria, where talented individuals, people who've acquired those skill sets that are very much in demand in say, Silicon Valley, how much does that account for the loss to the continent?
Yeah, so the brain drain is real and it's substantive. The way I want to think of the brain drain is you do not need to support a country or your country or to help or work for your country. You can contribute to your country's production. You can contribute to your country, not only through your own labor, but through adding more capital to your country. And one way is investing.
Yeah.
There are a lot of remittances coming from the West to more developed countries, to Africa. However, these remittances, they often come to supplant some basic social services that government should provide. Yes. So this is what is called usually the family tax. Okay, it is that these remittances often they are there because there is a lack, for example, of coverage of health insurance. So they are there to cover health issues, health bills. That's often. And so I think really we should think of how also the diaspora, African diaspora, can benefit also in investments. Now, we know in investments in particular, there are investments happening, mostly in many parts. So for example, in Senegal part is in real estate. And this is related to challenges for businesses to operate. For small and medium enterprises, they really need this financing. And this financing is limited because of issues that are specific sometimes. They are to the developing context or more acute, the developing context is like in this informal activity that I mentioned, when companies do not have clear financial statements at the end of the year that you can read, like that you have in the West, then you need to deal with assessing whether the company you are investing in will be someone who will be trustworthy and whether when they operate, they will deliver. Right. If you have a partnership that is based on equity, meaning that you are sharing the profits and losses, which is kind of the Islamic model of thinking of how we do partnership in business. So that's what limits these investments as well. Venture capital can go around this because they don't invest in the very small and medium enterprises. They small at a larger scale. So they will go off on dinners and have conversations with founders and assess and use some credentials to judge. But that's not something that is scalable because you cannot go and have a dinner and a conversation with every farmer, but also you don't have a registry that told you how well they performed if they had loans in the past. Yeah. So these are challenges that are really with economic challenges. These are some things we really understand in economics. The problem, what we call adverse selection, which is to select the person, you don't know whether this will be a person who has a good project that you can that they will work on. Yeah. And the other problem that even after investing in this person, because you don't have formal records, you are not certain that this is how much they produce. If you invest in a farmer, if they take a part of the production, there is no way for you to verify. So now these are what economists call often frictions, challenges that do not allow the seamless trading and investments happening. And these are places where governments can operate to think of really how to reduce these barriers, and that can drive investment and also productivity of firms. So to come back to the question of the brain drain, I think there can be some technology transfer coming from the diaspora who learn other methods of doing. There have been a lot of evidence that both the diaspora is beneficial to their host countries. So in America, for example, we find inventors, immigrants contribute a lot to innovation. Similarly as well, the diaspora contributes with new ideas, because ideas are important in a society. With new ideas, with different ways of doing things, and bringing also some of the standards as well in terms of production from the West. And they can benefit as well. They can be useful by tailoring their investments beyond real estate to look at the issues of to solve the issue of investing in medium and small enterprises.
Okay, so the context of this conversation today is, the live reality of Africa, and of course the context is that Africa has embraced or been asked to embrace many of the sort of the basic precepts of free market capitalism. In fact, just today we were discussing off camera. The Economist has a front page that Africa needs capitalism. Like from a from your perspective as an economist,
yes.
does Africa need more capitalism, or does it need to? Because for some of what you've just suggested there, in terms of like refinement of bureaucracies and refinement of economic activities, I mean that sounds very much within sort of that capitalist framework. So how do you, like, what's your view about more capitalism in Africa?
Yeah. So I think the term capitalism is often loaded. So I will rephrase things and make a statement related to that. I think Africa needs more growth today, more sustainable growth and structural transformation of the way in which we produce things. Because one thing that is very important for a country to develop is how much you can produce from the same amount of labor, the same number of people working the same hours, or the same amount of machines, capital, right? So that is productivity, right? We need to first increase productivity, right? And there are the ways in which you increase this productivity have nothing to do with capitalism per se. This is about educating people better. This is about all the barriers that can make production of the same number of machines or the same number of hours larger, right?
So it
frictions, exactly, right? So those are frictions now.
Yeah.
But I think thinking of capitalism as essentially just thinking of looking at the role of capital in the economy, expanding that, and also really emphasizing on that part alone at the detriment of having a healthy society, and educated youth, is not what I see as beneficial to Africa. So in a sense, when we mention capitalism, there are a lot of common sense things you want to do to reduce those frictions, to me, that are not inherently bad things about capitalism. But a society that emphasizes on mass production, right, which is producing more, but I'm really emphasizing more on producing more of the same things rather than just producing more for its own sake.
If we take one very important aspect of capitalism is a free market economy. And I suppose the principle there is that internally the economy should be run as frictionless as possible, but also there should be very few barriers to trade in terms of external trade and foreign direct investments. And now, you know, I suppose when the West talk about capitalism, they're probably maybe referring to this aspect of opening up countries and making sure countries are not do not have protections to trade. Now, you know, the left would argue that leads to a decline of homegrown industries, and it leads to. I remember reading many years ago, you know, in Cameroon, to purchase milk from a local farmer is far more expensive than to get milk powder that's imported in from Germany. So just, you know, focusing on that free market aspect, if you can, you know, are there any negatives to embracing that part of capitalism?
Yeah. So to answer this in the context of, let's say, sub-Saharan African countries, I think I need to go into a little bit of history,
please,
of how the economies came to be around, because that is important. I think in many African countries in the post-colonial time, the economy was mostly extractive. So the Nobel Prize winners of this year they were awarded for thinking of the institutions that were created by that were settled colonialism when they settled. Places where Europeans could settle ended up to be more developed because they built institutions that were more lasting. While where they couldn't settle because mortality was difficult, they mostly extracted the resources and left. And if you look at many places in Africa, that's where those extractive institutions that remained. Now, I prefer the better word. Instead of extractive, that sounds like this is just an adjective, but extraction happened. So this was an active act of extraction that happened. And when So European countries extracted resources.
Yeah.
They didn't build the infrastructure in place for trade to happen within.
Right.
They mostly built ports and ways to disseminate from the train to the port and to the boat to Europe.
Yes.
Right? Now, why is this relevant? These institutions, they are persistent, so they stay over time, even if, like you see, for example, in Italy, if you go to Florence, the same families that in the 1400s that were the richest are still now the richest.
Right.
And so this time is not that far off. We are 60, 70 years from that. Now, this persists now.
Really?
This institutional reality is a reality in Africa.
Yeah.
So now when you look at then trade within Africa is very low. And this is one reason as well. We don't have the infrastructure necessary to do this value-added creation in our own goods and services we produce beyond minerals, adding them, refining them, and trading between us within Africa. So trade with Europe, with China is much stronger.
Yes.
Now, facing this reality now, let's answer your question now. So what should we do? Should we liberalize trade altogether?
Yes.
Right? And should we have some protections? Right? I want to examine this in the light of the institutional factors I mentioned, and another point which will come next, which is on the geopolitical reality of our time now.
Yeah.
So first, in light of the institutions. So what happens actually, you see, African countries are mostly importers, right? So they export raw materials and they import final goods from, they import milk that is processed from overseas. And overall, so they are not competitive with other countries.
Yeah.
And I think here there is an argument for doing what is called industrial policy. So industrial policy is looking at the reality where we are now. We can follow and produce those goods in which we are the best at relatively. Yeah. So that's where we say we have comparative advantage.
This is Ricardo's idea.
Yes.
I remember from my undergraduate days.
Yeah.
Yes.
So you focus on producing,
Yes.
Wheat and other producing cloth.
Yes.
However, there can be sometimes even some impediment to be because of the bad infrastructure in place, low productivity in agriculture and so on. So there is room there to decide, okay, I want to invest in strengthening the agriculture industry and looking at, for example, cacao in Côte d'Ivoire, which has been their staple, where they have been exporting it, and say, okay, let me subsidize so that they can refine it to add value, or let me subsidize exporting it. So they are interventions of the government. So they are not, in a sense, capitalist policies, right? But they can be useful, I think, for Africa. So industrial policy targeting industries rather than just individual firms, because if you target individual firms, often you create winners and losers within firms, and it can create this cronyism with these sometimes weak institutions. Yeah. Right? And now, so on the point now you mentioned, right, is you can have milk being imported in Cameroon while they just sell the raw milk directly.
Yes.
In Senegal is an example where you see also a lot of, even on the stalls in the streets, you see imported goods. Okay, so I think there is room there to do industrial policy to limit these. Now, it's going to be true that really the reality is productivity is low in agriculture. And so we need to think of how to mechanize. Yes, right. The other point I wanted to mention as well is that the one of fragmentation, the world we live in now, which is if you look at trade, a lot of trade now is happening not just purely driven by this Ricardo idea, but also when people say like, oh, I'm going to trade with my friends and I'm not going to trade with my enemies. And this is something to keep in mind as well as we have a regime change in the US. Donald Trump is going to come, and Donald Trump said he's going to put 100% tariff on BRICS countries. Okay, so what is the response of these countries should be. I think there is room for them to prioritize trading among themselves and have trade agreements, strengthen trade agreements. Okay, but there are challenges with the trade agreements within. And for example, if we take the case of West African countries, you have ECOWAS, which is our economic and trade agreement.
Yes.
The difficulty is there have been some countries that are under military rule now, and they've decided to create the Sahel States group. And the Sahel States group see the ECOWAS as more of an institution that is under the French control, and they want to exit this agreement. And their notice it's going to be a year soon that this will be in place. Then there are challenges related to how they will navigate strengthening this ECOWAS or having splintered groups when it comes to trade. So intra-Africa trade really is a key element that needs to be strengthened, and that in response to the other geopolitical realities out there, we need to think of carefully how to develop it between Africans. There are different groups. You have Eastern group. Eastern group have their trade agreements, Southern group, Northern African group, and Central African and West African groups having different trade agreements.
Yes.
And really strengthening, under the African Union umbrella, but the African Union has not been as effective in this. There is the African ZLECAf in French, African Free Trade area that is put in place as well, but this hasn't been as effective into getting trade to expand.
So can I pick up on that point about intra-African trade? Because I've always wondered whether the European Union is a fantastic project, but just in the wrong continent, the wrong place, because these nation states are very consolidated, and the divisions between European states, as we can see today, are becoming far more pronounced. Whereas when we consider Africa, I mean, these are post-colonial constructs. In many ways, cultures and peoples do not confine themselves to the nation-state boundaries as much as maybe some European countries. You know, these divisions are not as pronounced in Africa, even though sometimes leaders come along who try to carve out those divisions. Like, how valuable would be like a European Union, full integration? We're talking economic and political union with free trade and with free movement of people with a single currency. Like, how realistic, but also how valuable would such an organization be for Africa as a continent?
I think it would be very valuable. One of the strengths of Nigeria is that it's a federation of 200 million people.
Wow,
and when businesses start in Nigeria, they have access to a large market. So if you look at all the billionaires almost from Africa, it's the same blueprint. Most of them are from Nigeria, and they work in staples that feed millions of people, and they have large market access.
Wow.
Right? Now, how do you, on the issue of peoples in Africa and the barriers? Like, you know, after colonization, there was a divide and conquer mindset that happened that led to division on a map of different countries in Africa. These divisions often do not map to ethnicities and language groups in the continent. One example is the Fulani tribe, which you can see all the way from Senegal all the way to Niger and so on. So the whole Sahel region. And they are in different countries. There are a few variations in their language, but it's the same culture. And they can be Nigerian, they can be Cameroonian, they can be Ghanaian, they can be Senegalese, they can be Guinean, they can be Malian, they can be Mauritanian. Okay, so this tells us that maybe also we need to go beyond the colonial barriers. Now, there is a lot of, I think, cheap talk around this. And the difficulty has always been whenever there are initiatives around this, either they are too simplistic and utopic,
yes,
or they have been nipped in the bud due to geopolitical tensions and other countries meddling in the projects.
Are we talking principally Western countries here?
Yes. So we're talking about Western countries. So, for example, Libya, Muammar Gaddafi was a large proponent of the African Union.
Yeah.
He really wanted and had a message of African unity. Many people have been killed as well pushing for African unity. Cheikh Anta Diop was a scientist from Senegal known for his work on Egypt and thinking of African origin of humanity, which is now and has been established as evidence, even though some of his work has been criticized for good reason, but he did some work, but at the time it wasn't popular.
Yeah.
We have had thinkers like Kwame Nkrumah giving a Pan-African message.
Yeah.
People like Thomas Sankara, who was killed by his friend, who many suspect that was working with France. And Thomas Sankara had the Pan-African view, but had a view that it was through the military that the society would be somewhat educated and disciplined to go beyond the loss in human capital that came from colonization, right?
Yes.
And so we had Patrice Lumumba as well. All of these people who have faced difficulty went to jail, some of them killed.
Yes.
And then you had next generation coming, the remaining, which were mostly the neo-colonial elite who didn't care much about their people, who were mostly put there because they were there ready to accept what the West imposed on them. Now, to have this unity, we need to be realistic, that we need to start from our own common zones, right? Strengthen them, use a language. The language in our time, the lingua franca, the language that all uses is not Latin, is not Arabic anymore, it's English. So we need to organize ourselves around English. We need to strengthen our common currencies and maybe go beyond that to have a common currency. I think, though, those are things that can be done from the policy perspective, because, if you ask, can an African government develop their country? Certainly, it's not up to them, because I believe it's firms that develop a country, and it's firms that operate, that provide jobs.
Yes.
But can they use their energy to sit at a table, have conversations, strengthen trade agreements, and break barriers among themselves? Again, so these breaking barriers, certainly you can categorize them as capitalism, and maybe these are good parts of capitalism within themselves to strengthen inter-Africa trade, add value to their goods, okay? And the cacao from Ivory Coast being transformed into coffee to be sent and sold in Senegal, instead of Senegal buying the Nescafe from overseas or produced overseas from those cacao beans. So then, after developing these regions and strengthening the Africa Free Trade Agreement we currently have and free trade zone that is on paper, we can then look at the question of a common currency. I do not see any reason why this cannot be a reality. The world moves very quickly, and as we have seen with COVID, things can happen with being unexpected. With AI, things are going to move very quickly. So I think we need more discussion of trade and investment among African countries, and that's a priority in my view.
And do you feel there's an appetite for that within the continent? I mean, I sometimes get the impression that even the West may find it very difficult or not want to transform these extractive economies because it doesn't serve their interests. France wouldn't want that, and America wouldn't want that. But at the same time, you do see some inertia from African rulers, African leaders who are who do not like the idea of giving up control over their nation state to, what would essentially be supranational bodies.
The tricky part in this conversation is some countries are facing challenges on many dimensions. We know in Sudan there is a war. In Congo there is conflict related to minerals, and so they might not even have the bandwidth to have the diplomatic personnel to undertake this. There is also the division, even in West Africa, between ECOWAS countries and the Alliance of Sahel countries, which are military which are under military rule.
Yeah.
So it's a tricky situation. Right. Now, the way I think this can be addressed start with the relationship that these countries have with foreign powers, with France, with the US, with England, with Russia as well, because some of these military-led countries, they took out the French flag and replaced it with a Russian flag.
Yeah.
So what do I mean by that? The discussions around aid should turn to discussions around investment and trade. I think a lot of the limitations that you have between these countries uniting is that some of the countries will think, this has been, for example, in the West African sense, when you talk about having a common currency between the countries that are using currently the franc CFA, which is this franc that was the colonial franc, whose name was turned into a sort of a Rosetta Stone that we saw today, like a dictionary inversion. It turns from the franc of the French colonies of Africa to the franc of the financial community of Africa. So just a little word twist.
Yes.
So these countries have been trying to connect with Nigeria and have potentially a common currency called the ECO. Okay. Now, the difficulty has been Nigeria thinking that, we don't want France to be the supervisor of our currency. Because essentially these countries have a fixed peg with the euro because this was guaranteed by the central bank in France. Yeah. Now the arrangements have changed on paper, but this has been what has historically been the case. So this is an example so Nigeria thinking, France is, these are essentially under the French rule. And those countries also thinking, Nigeria is a big bloc.
Yes.
They rely a lot on oil. We already seen how the exchange rate has depreciated a lot.
Yeah.
And these countries are like, okay, this is a risk for us. So how do we navigate this?
Yeah.
In the end, I think these countries, instead of making a choice, this can be sometimes drastic or painful, and see whether the political reality can be accepted.
Yes.
To say, okay, maybe we want to get rid of the colonial aspects of this currency. We want to think of now from a first principle, given where we are, if we were to keep a common currency, how would it look like? Would it be a flexible exchange rate regime like Nigeria, where it moves around depending on our commodities? Or do we keep it fixed with the euro or with the dollar? Or how do we can integrate it together?
Yeah.
And I think by switching their discussion, their relationship with Europe and the US away from aid to away from also political influence and diplomatic influence at the UN. We've seen aid being correlated a lot with votes at the UN.
Yeah.
To one of just trade and investment, then they can be credible that they are free of these countries. And this is a movement that is happening somewhat in what is called the France-Afrique, this part of Africa that has been under French influence. And that from this next step, the next step will be a discussion, a strengthening really of trade between these countries. And beyond that, they can see what the next steps will be.
Can I ask you about two particular countries? And I know, your expertise cannot range from, you wouldn't have expertise over each and every single country intimately in Africa, but it's something which bothers me. I mean, Congo is an interesting example.
Yes.
As you said in your answer there, Congo has internally it has a problem, but also Congo is rich in natural resources, cobalt, I think, which is extremely important. Diamonds,
coltan.
So the first question really is about Congo. Like, what is it that prevents Congo, which has such gifted, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has gifted it with such tremendous resources? Why is it that Congo is, if not the poorest, one of the poorest countries in Africa? And the second point is about Nigeria, which is, I think you suggested or intimated it earlier on, but Nigeria should be and is the powerhouse of Africa. It's an extremely diverse country, but also a country which has resources and potential and a young population. Yet that there doesn't seem to be, using the capitalist term, a trickle down where the petroleum revenue actually, and its impact doesn't seem to be trickling down to the population. So just take me through, the Congo example, which is a very poor country, and Nigeria, which is, far more affluent country, but some of the inherent structural problems in those two countries.
So the Congo example is it's a country that is very rich in minerals. So has cobalt, diamonds, copper.
Yeah.
But the country has been plagued by conflict.
Yeah.
And this has been the remnants of colonization, and you had decades of dictatorship. One example is Mobutu, who had been there for a long time, and with the weak institutions that came out from the colonial period as well,
right.
These elites mostly captured the resources from the proceeds of these minerals and park them into tax havens around the world, in the Western world, that are also complicit of this, and really didn't provide any public goods for their people. And so what that led is a resource curse, right? That, because of these minerals can be captured very easily, they only value is being extracted. They are not creating, because to extract minerals, you don't need even a bachelor's degree. Right. So you need to create those other jobs. You need to use those resources, the revenues, to create schools, to hospitals, and educate the people so they can do the other jobs and transform, right? The difference between Gulf countries that they have been doing this diversification to transform their economies, and so people can be educated and so on. So this is the issue with, I'm not saying that these Gulf countries are examples in a way, but I want to just give that their resources have been more smoothly managed in that regard. Yeah. And so that's really the challenge with Congo. And there are various militia and armed factions which exploit the mineral resources to fund their operations. Yeah. And it's really kind of a Wild West where people are fighting for these resources. And the multinational corporations that on top they mostly extract resources and do not provide the safety and provide the public goods necessary for this. That's kind of the overall big picture case in the Congo. Nigeria is somewhat of a different situation, because if you look at, for example, Nigeria right now doesn't even have foreign military presence. Nigeria has been plagued by military coups and wars at the time of this South wanting to secede. But since the 2000s, Nigeria has been stable in that sense and has had politically a federation where you have a lot of different stakeholders that kind of keep a political equilibrium that is somewhat stable, even though you have sometimes some conflict arising. But overall, Nigeria has some advantages, but has been struggling lately. The advantage Nigeria had is since they faced this time, after this time of instability, they had some sort of a agreement that all factions are somewhat okay, most of the oil is in the south, but there is some transfer of resources to the north. The south is very productive, Lagos, but they got to that point where they can actually go beyond just minerals and oil. In that, in Lagos, you have a lot of companies, most of the, in fintech, for example, most of the unicorns come from there. And once you start seeing companies in Africa solving the problems of the people themselves, then you see the window of growth opening up. Yeah. Because if it's just minerals, then we are still in the extractive phase and we are not going to go beyond it. And this can be trapped under resource curse. So Nigeria, by having companies doing different things, by having people working also in the services sector for the world in general, it has good trajectory. Now, especially since under the previous administration, the Buhari administration, there have been a lot of bad choices that were made around trying to artificially keep exchange rate guided, despite the realities that were different. So you had an exchange rate of the currency, the Naira, in the black market that was very different from the official one. And so actually, in fact, the governor of the central bank has had legal issues because of corruption around this, arbitraging the currency. So that led to, after they got rid of these guided exchange rate artificially guided to be fixed, and also lifting some of the subsidies that they were doing for fuel, that their currency depreciated a lot. So now that means that you will have less US dollars for the same amount of Nairas. Yeah. And so that's a very tough period. That's what they are facing currently. Yeah. But I really can see also a recovery happening for Nigeria, in that once they manage these issues around the exchange rate, they've had a lot of multinationals leaving as a result, and other companies leaving, because their revenue from operating in Nigeria, just once they repatriate it, is not that large because of this 70% drop in the value of their currency, which is pretty drastic. But that was the reality that they should have faced. But moving forward, the fact that they face their own challenges, it's rough in Nigeria. I go to Nigeria often, and Nigeria doesn't have provided, if you live there, you need to provide water for your home. Electricity often goes off, and it's on a managed schedule of disruptions. Yeah. You also need to manage your own security. But because there is what I call a creative disruption. So economists have this notion of creative destruction, which is that in an economy, sometimes you need new firms coming in and they will topple the old firms. The typical examples is when we talk about the modern cameras, digital cameras, and Kodak not embracing them, and then they topple those, and that's how innovation happens. So this is the idea of creative destruction of Schumpeter. Like, I think similarly for states, there is a creative disruption that needs to happen, and I think this creative disruption might have happened for Nigeria already. For the France-Afrique countries, for the Francophone countries, it hasn't happened yet. So if you go to Dakar GDP is 40% lower than Nigeria, Senegal's GDP. But you feel like quality of life is much better. Right. You have resorts, electricity all around, internet, water, everything is running. Yeah. But it's all because these are managed by mostly foreign companies. Okay? So we haven't built the national security resources to make these as local companies.
Right.
Okay, and that is important because
in Senegal, you
in
mean?
Senegal, in Senegal, that is also relatively the case in Côte d'Ivoire as well. Even though Côte d'Ivoire has built more infrastructure than Senegal, and has advanced much more on this dimension.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think so. The issue why I'm mentioning the example of Nigeria here is, I think despite the challenges they are facing their own problems through this creative disruption that already occurred for them.
Yeah.
And now by having more and more companies there who are solving the problems, really that's what tells you, okay, there is an economy beyond just minerals here. Yeah. We can add value to things, and then that will push other companies, foreign companies, to come and also solve the people's problems.
Yeah.
Okay, that beyond just extraction, right? So I think those are some examples.
Yeah.
They are not the example that are most talked about. Nigeria, many commentators would not give you Nigeria as the main, but I think really being such a large country, with such a large market, it can drive a lot of Africa, and it has a lot of the large youth in Africa as well, and it has a lot of innovations in financial technologies and so on with its challenges. Yeah.
You paint a really interesting picture between the quality of life in Senegal, which is a, relatively speaking, a poorer country, to that of Nigeria, which has load shedding, electricity problems, security issues, and there are all sorts of frictions to ordinary business and ordinary life. Now, I wonder how much that's down to the adoption of what would be termed orthodox, let's not call it capitalist, but orthodox economic policies. I mean, I remember a while back reading, I think it was Baitulmal, who's a developmental economist, I think, from Nigeria, who argued that, in a sense, these orthodox policies are not fit in an African context. And maybe Senegal, even if it hasn't, its economy is not growing. So I suppose, this is an anti-growthism argument. Its economy isn't growing. The quality of life of Senegalese is far better. And maybe that's what we want. We want to live, sorry to sound philosophical here, but we want to live happy lives.
I want to qualify when I say quality of life in Dakar, I think, but there are many rural parts in Senegal, quality life is not as good. I think I compared more broadly also because Nigeria has one limitation that it has is the state provides much less services, welfare state. And I think the welfare state is important.
Yes.
Health, protection, education, right? It's really to each their own, right? Very low, one of the lowest in the world.
Really?
Okay? Yes.
In Nigeria?
In Nigeria, yes. And but you have also a lot of inequalities as well. Okay, even So but what I mentioned in Dakar in particular, Dakar is a very small, tiny part of Senegal. Yet it's the capital, right? Everything is concentrated there. I wanted to give it as a stark difference because it's a kind of like a town where you have a lot of foreigners. There's that this quality of life is maintained mostly because you have the businesses, the large corporations are mostly foreign owned.
Yes.
Okay. And you have as well this band-aid of protection of these business interests by foreign governments.
Yeah.
Right? You don't have any of that in Nigeria.
Yeah.
And so the creative disruption is in the sense that you need protection when this is more extraction. So and this is where I want to come to the recent Macron statements. So Emmanuel Macron, the French president, who said that Africans should be thankful. And I think he should call more for a message of mutual respect than a paternalistic call for being thankful.
Yeah, to France.
To France, yes. Africans should be thankful to France. Otherwise, there wouldn't be any state if it were not for French troops.
Yeah.
So I think there is room for defending an industry when this industry is extracting, right? You keep the militia, you keep some sort of protection for extracting industries.
Right.
But when there is not this extraction happening, then you are just solving problems.
Yes.
So this is exchange that is coming out of mutual respect and mutual gains.
Yes.
In that moment, you don't need any more military bases. Okay? And that is why I'm juxtaposing and comparing the Senegal case here with the Nigerian case.
Yes.
In the sense that, so the band-aid that is in this case is that one where everything works. You have electricity, you have water, but productivity is very low, and GDP per capita is much lower than in the Nigerian case where it's chaos.
So to pick up on that orthodoxy point, I mean, so maybe Senegal isn't the example, but I don't know, Mauritania, or there may be another example of a happy place which hasn't urbanized and hasn't industrialized and it isn't obsessed about productivity and growth. Yet, it's not mired with security problems and electricity problems and crime and the rest of it. Like, is that even a conversation to be had in Africa? Because
you started mentioning this, mentioning Dambisa Mayo's book.
Yes.
Dead Aid.
Yes.
Right.
That's it.
And her argument has a flavor of what I'm talking about here, because her point is that aid sometimes disrupts the local industries themselves. You have dependencies, and this is a reality. Yes.
Yes.
The aid becomes an industry. Like there is a joke, like when aid comes, you have the SUV that comes with the Westerner in the village, and then at the end, the Westerner leaves, the SUV stays for the program manager of that aid project domestically. And the village stays as well, So that's the joke. Yeah. So I think aid can be disruptive. That's why we need to move from aid to talking about trade and investment.
Right.
Now, on the issue of should we not grow, and for me, I'm very clear on that. I'm not a degrowth person. I think growth is very important, and African countries need to grow because, first of all, their population grow. So you need to grow to at least feed your population, your growing population. So that, in that sense, these measures that we often talk about, like GDP, gross domestic product, which measures the production within a country in a given year of goods and services, at least need to grow at the rate in which the population is growing, right? So that you can feed more mouths. And then it needs to grow beyond to also that people's incomes can rise, right? So living standards can rise, people can be healthier, so that also you can repay the debt that many of the countries are mired into. So I wouldn't say that there are degrowth stories or there should be degrowth stories in Africa.
Right.
I think we cannot get around the fact that we need to grow the pie. Now I think there is a lot of sensibilities for many people, and also as Muslims, understanding that our life is not just the material life, but also a spiritual one. And from Senegal, where I'm from, is a great example of that. It's what I would call the world capital of Sufism.
Yes.
And it's a pleasure to see how this is also nurtured and cherished as well. And that's part of our things that that people value, that adds to the quality of life as well.
We haven't spoken yet about China and China's role in the continent, because of course, in terms of trade now, I think China has a greater share of trade with individual African countries than European and American companies, and so the Chinese are very central to the economic story of Africa, and the common wisdom, or at least that which is disseminated by the Chinese and the supporters of Chinese, is that China does not come into Africa with that exploitative underbelly that many Western companies have, and China does not require the thick values of liberalism and human rights in order to do trade. And in a sense, when Chinese companies do access resources, there is a more delicate footprint, I suppose, of those companies. So how do you rate China versus European and maybe even Russian and American companies in terms of Africa?
I think so. It is different.
Yeah.
In form, but not in. China is different in form, but not in terms of outcomes. I think they get paid in a different way. All right. So European and American companies, or the European countries as well, get paid in the form of like their extra resources as well. China gets paid in terms of geopolitical power. So many of China's investment, so they have done a lot of infrastructure funding. They built the Addis Ababa Djibouti railway, and they often will have a clause that allows them to seize some asset.
Really?
Angola exchanged oil for roads, hospitals, and housing built by China, and they will be able to collect some asset on the other side in case the country doesn't repay.
Right.
And also often we found there is some evidence as well in terms of voting at the UN as well, voting along the lines for China, for countries that received this Belt and Road initiative from China. So I think they get paid in a different way, either in kind, in some sense. And so, but they give concessionary loans, lower rates to buy for this geopolitical power in the global scene. Yes. And the way I think about now, maybe what is the attitude of what should be the attitude of African countries, I don't see that African countries should try and say, hey, look, we are geopolitically strong, like in the way in which the US portrays, or China or Russia. But rather, be more focused on economic outcomes, understand the fragmentation of the world, and make countries pay for and have a geopolitical competition around them. Not limit themselves to one partner. And I think that's the message we keep. Many countries just limit themselves to their former colonial master. Yeah. But now just say, okay, we are partners, we negotiate, we look at what China offers, we look at what Russia offers, we look at what the US offers. And I think this is important, and even for people who are also in Western institutions as well, to understand that we do things for humanity. We are not Western spoke people, but really we want to think of for African countries, what is in their best interest? It's not replacing a French flag with a Russian flag, but what does they provide conditions, each of them, that the US, to deal with the US, you will not deal with China. To deal with the US, you will not deal with Iran, or you will not deal with Russia. They believe that certain values are better than other values. Africans might have different values, and Africans even within themselves might be split on these values as well. So to each of them to look at the competition, the geopolitical competition, and not try to say, okay, I'm also geopolitically strong. Often what happens is that then you have a military invasion coming your way. Libya is one example.
Yes.
So I think it needs to be strategic, understand the reality, be realistic that, each of the countries are not on their own militarily strong, geopolitically strong, but they can have their sovereignty, not have colonial presence in terms of military, in a military form or monetary form, okay? Like having a monetary colonial money.
Yes.
And say now, okay, I'm ready to trade with everyone. I'm ready to also geopolitically have alliances, but I'm open to others as well.
Yeah.
And, let the competition in a fragmented world now but I think often sometimes some countries will do the mistake of kind of forcing some sort of alignment either through historical arguments, and often these are flawed. Africa has been, in many parts of Africa, colonized, been at war, and suppressed in the world stage.
Yeah.
So we should take this more as an opportunity to develop our economies and be pragmatic and strategic rather than just benevolent alignments.
In your answer there, you talked about values and the values of Africans. But of course, as you said, you intimated Africa is a very diverse continent.
Yes.
Now, at the very beginning, in my introduction, I spoke of the 400 million Muslims in Africa. So that's 45% of Africa are actually Muslims, which is an astonishing figure, really. How important are the values of Islam in the economic future and the economic story and the economic narrative of Africa?
A large population of Africa is Muslim. Like you said, if you look at the map of Africa, the Sahel is kind of somewhat of a delimitation of what used to be the limit to the north of the Sahel. You have Islam, and then now you have more and more Muslim, even in some parts of Central Africa, South Africa, the eastern part of Africa has large Muslim populations, and also north part.
Yeah.
Now, the values of Islam really are present here and are important. And I think when I talked about financing medium and small enterprises, the idea is really to think of how to scale the arrangement that our Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, had with his wife Khadija, which is this profit and loss sharing agreements, which what Islamic finance is supposed to really put in place. So there is work that some economists are doing to address these issues I told you earlier of how to select projects, adverse selection, and how to avoid the challenges with not having good information on firms and so on. So I think these issues, right, how to scale medium and small enterprises can benefit a lot from what we learn in Islam, and take that as an opportunity to think of how can we have equity arrangements and develop them for these countries. So that's one thing. The other elements is that we can avoid, using Islamic principles, a lot of issues that plague the Western world. And I think, even in the principles of business being halal, to avoid gambling that can create problems. We see that gambling has been on the rise a lot in Africa. So gambling platforms now are everywhere. There are gambling platforms connected with sports. Okay, they create a lot of risk, and they make some people lose all their incomes, and it becomes very detrimental. So using these principles can avoid a lot of these issues. We have as well, in a lot of usage of the internet, is pornography, we know. And this is another industry that is frowned upon by our religion. And I think the world is waking up also to the usage of alcohol. And many of the new generation will tell you that they will probably see alcohol as we used to see smoking tobacco 20 years ago. Right? And the question around also finding solutions to riba is really addressing this problem, which is a problem in Islam, really also is at the forefront of some of the things that Muslim majority nations in Africa face as well, okay, among other nations. So there is a lot of reliance on debt, reliance on external debt. There have been one of the most contentious elements around international organization right now like the IMF and the discussions with the African countries is the credit rating of African countries. So there is this, what we call global financial cycle, that when overall the US economy struggles, then this will in turn make the poorer countries, and some African countries as well, less likely to be able to repay their debt.
Yes.
This leads to the credit agencies, the credit rating agencies, downgrading the debt of African countries, even though they might have a good history of repayment. So many of these African countries found this unfair because this global financial cycle is not under their own responsibility, but it's a reality that when the economy overall, the whole world struggles, they think that Africa will struggle more. Okay? So there is this realization that African countries, or especially sub-Saharan African countries, cannot keep on going with paying interest north of 8-9%. And thinking of other alternative investments with the private and public partnerships based on equity is at the forefront as well of some of the principles of Islam. And also how to raise local finances. So local financing, we have modes of taxation. Islam recommends some sort of wealth tax. You have challenges of collecting that wealth tax, same as income tax, like in the developing world and in Africa as well, because you don't have income statements. But where a lot of African countries are going is strengthening property taxation, right? Because property is often investment vehicle that you can observe. It's not moving anywhere, so you can tax it. So you have a lot of reforms to increase property taxation. But to kind of wrap up the answer of this, I think I wanted to end though by saying that for this particular question, Africa has a rich history of Islam. We have had the Sokoto Caliphate. We have had a long presence of Islam in Africa since 1200s. We have had writings in Ajami script, which was this Arabic adapted to the local languages. And in these writings, you read lessons about how to raise a family. You read lessons about the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. You read lessons about economic principles. You read lessons about how to manage the court system. And so I think building on its version of Islam, its version is endogenous version of Islam, and also it is understanding and accepting version of many of the Sufi brotherhood that were there. Africa can benefit a lot from these lessons of Islam. And I wanted to give an example. Please, so it is the Murid brotherhood in Senegal, the Mouridia brotherhood, which is one important economic power.
Yeah.
And this Sufi brotherhood organizes and creates a lot of public spaces, mosques, hospitals, and they all farm together under their sheikh. In the summer, they go and farm, and then they collect in Touba region and Khelkom from the peanuts that is farmed, and from these they will build the city, essentially. And they create trade networks as well all around the world, not only in Senegal, but around the world, in the US, in France, and everywhere they are, where they unite, they invest back home as well. And they are all driven by their religion and their shared values, and that they make benefit their families and their country and their brotherhood in general.
Professor Abdoulaye Ndiaye, I think that's been a really fascinating conversation today. I could probably go on for another hour and a half, but I think we have to pause there. So Jazakallah khair. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in this studio in London and to have seen such a wonderful places and to have walked through places where John Maynard Keynes, Jeremy Bentham's embalmed body lays, and to be in the room where Karl Marx has written Das Kapital, and to meet you.
Barakallah feek. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.
Thank you. Alaikum assalam.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.